Hey, and welcome back to another installment of My Storage Room is Full of Orphan Drums and Parts, and it's time to do some projects to thin out the herd. Working title. One project that's been on my mind for a number of years now is to build a popcorn snare. Now, I think plenty of people are familiar with the popcorn snares made by Pearl or other companies that are smaller diameters, like 10 to 12 inches, with normal depths and meant to be tuned higher like a side snare. What I'm talking about is not that. This is literally a snare with popcorn inside of it to be a substitute for the snare wires you'd have on the bottom and have a rattle sound coming from actual popcorn kernels. So years ago, I saw this company, Creative Percussion, at the Chicago Drum Show, and they make a ton of different really cool accessories, but they also make a few simple drums as well. And one of them is what I was talking about before, a popcorn snare. So let's see if I can pull it up here. By the way, I have their low profile hi-hat clutch and it's amazing and worth every penny. Okay, here. So you can see they have these pancake effects toms and their popcorn snares down here, which is pretty much the same thing, but with popcorn inside. They sell it in 6, 8, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So a ton of different varieties. I'm probably going to be using some sort of old tom to build this, so let's just take a look at this 12-inch version. So like I was saying, there are literally popcorn kernels inside this drum that kind of bounce around and create that rattly snare sound, as opposed to having snare wires mounted on the drum, which would require a lot more hardware, because then you would need a snare throw and a snare butt plate mounted on the shell. And with this one, you can see the shell is like maybe 2 to 3 inches deep. There's just enough room for the hoops and the heads to tension on. And then this is a single tension drum where you have the tension rod going through the top hoop and then through the bottom hoop attaching to some sort of nut to tighten it. Now, if you're not handy with tools and stuff like that, Creative Percussion is great and you should just buy this. But that's not my style. I'm much more of a DIY guy. So I want to build this, and it seems pretty simple and like a project that I can do in a couple of hours. So I thought it would be fun to time myself and see how fast I can get this project done from start to finish. So without further ado, let's get started. Ideally, I wanted to find something like a 12 or 13-inch tom to use. From what I could gather, you really don't need much depth, maybe 2 to 3 inches, but it's important to have a shell without any extra holes from lugs or mounts, because I'd need to plug them in order for the popcorn kernels inside the drum not to fly out while playing or just fall out while moving the drum. After going through my stock of orphan shells, I ended up settling on this 14-inch Bud Light tom that had a good 4 to 5 inches of hole-free space in the middle of the shell. While I was already back in the storage room, I decided to go ahead and find the other parts I'd need, like the hoops, some clear heads so I could see the inside of the drum while playing, and some tension rods and corresponding nuts to secure them to the shell. I started by removing the wrap, and since it was only adhered with tape at the ends, I was able to take a razor blade and cut the adhesive back at the seam to remove that side, and then carefully pry it off the shell, making sure to not rip the outer ply at all. I then made my way upstairs and got my table saw out in order to cut down the shell. I knew I'd need at least 1.5 to 2 inches in order to allow the head collars to tighten around the shell, so I started by cutting one segment out just over 1.5 inches, but then went ahead and cut out one more segment, more like 2 to 3 inches in depth, just in case the shallower shell wouldn't be enough. I figured it made sense to do this now, so I wouldn't need to come up and do it again if the first wasn't deep enough. I then brought these 2 segments over to my router table to cut some new bearing edges. I typically like to do this in multiple passes, removing just a small bit of material at a time to avoid chew out, but since this shell isn't anything great, and I honestly just wanted to get this done as quickly as possible, I did it all in one pass. After getting the larger cuts done on the inside of the shell, I came back to the outside and did a very small outer profile to be left with a standard double 45-degree edge found on plenty of drums. Since my cuts were pretty rough, I had to come back and do some sanding to clean up the inside edge, but it really wasn't more than a couple minutes to get them feeling nice and smooth. After sanding, I checked the edges on my granite slab to confirm flatness, and then moved on to staining. This step is totally optional, and it surely would have been quicker to skip, but I figured it might look a little nicer, and again, it didn't take more than a few minutes to add stain to the inside and outside of these narrow shells. I know most drums don't have stain on the inside, but honestly, I just didn't feel like taping up the edges or being careful with my staining, so it just made sense to do it everywhere and have it be clean and consistent. While I waited for the stain to dry, I needed to make a fast trip over to my local grocery store.
Let's get some popcorn.
Since I live in modern times, I usually just get bags of popcorn to make in the microwave, but those have butter and other sorts of oils on them, so I needed to get some dry kernels to put in this drum in order to not make a mess. From what I understand, the decision to use popcorn over something like lead shot or other beads is that they have an irregular shape, which keeps the kernels from not rolling around as much after the initial hit on the drum. I was able to find a small bag of kernels for just over $3, which would end up being my only investment on this project, so I was pretty happy with that. After checking out and paying, I made my way back to the car to get home and finish this project out. If I was planning ahead, I could have easily knocked off 10 to 15 minutes of time on this project by buying the popcorn ahead of time, but since I needed to wait for the stain to dry a bit, I figured it wasn't too much of a waste to go pick up these kernels now. When I got home, I brought the 2 shell segments and popcorn kernels back downstairs to begin assembling this drum. After doing a dry fit with the shallower shell, I realized it probably wasn't going to be deep enough to tension, but it surely wasn't going to be deep enough to give the kernels room to fly around inside the shell. Luckily, since I had already created a second shell with a bit more depth, I didn't have to backtrack and add any more time onto this project. I was taking a shot in the dark of how much popcorn to use, but decided to try to get a single layer of coverage across maybe half of the bottom head. Once I had the drum filled, I could add on the top head and begin tuning up the drum, finding tension rods long enough to pass through from the top to bottom hoop, and then securing them to a nut. Unlike most of my projects, this one requires no drilling, as the shell is truly free-floating. The tension rods are not in contact with the shell, and just rely on the holes in the hoops to keep the spacing consistent for even tuning. After getting this drum completely tuned up, I could go in and check how long it took me from start to finish to do this project. Even though the timer reads just over an hour, I'm going to go ahead and give myself the 5-minute discount, considering how much time I spent setting up and moving my camera between each of these steps. I went ahead and recorded a quick demo for you at a couple tunings to hear how this sounds, and after those play through, I'll come back and wrap this video up by giving you my final thoughts on this drum and the project. Okay, so let's be real, this thing is pretty one-dimensional. There's very limited definition and sensitivity when it comes to the snare sound, but in the spirit of finding the positive, I will say I enjoyed this drum when it was cranked up and laying in with heavy rim shots. It reminds me a lot of a gunshot with tons of attack on the front end and then dissipating really quickly. This could certainly be cool as a sort of sound effect or a layered sample in the mix of a dense groove supporting a traditional snare sound. My only other issue with this drum comes from the challenge of setup. I typically like my snare tilted towards me, and on this drum, in order to have even spread of kernels inside the drum, you really need to try and have it as level as possible. On the version of this that Creative Percussion sells, they actually have a level attached to the head to help with this. I briefly considered buying one of these small adhesive levels on Amazon, but in the end, I figured I'd just use my eyes to try to get it as flat as possible. All in all, considering I spent less than $4 on this project, and just over an hour of my time making it, it's hard to be disappointed with the results, but if you were expecting this to be some sort of secret hack to get a great snare sound, I think your expectations are a bit too high. With that said though, I really enjoyed putting this drum together, and I could certainly see myself pulling it out for a specific project down the road. I'm sure there will be a few of you who watch this and absolutely hate it, but for the others who found this fun or at least entertaining, maybe you can put one of these together for yourself, or better yet, support a small business like Creative Percussion, who does a great job with all sorts of different instruments and accessories. I'd love to hear what you all think about this drum, so good or bad, let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel to stay up to date on all of my future video releases, and until next time, thanks.